I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're standing right in the middle of a dense, overgrown jungle.
Oh, setting the scene. I like it.
Yeah, right. So you brush aside this massive dripping fern, and suddenly, rising straight out of the green canopy, is this towering, intricately carved stone pyramid.
Like a classic Maya city.
Exactly. The ruins of a once thriving Maya city. Or, picture yourself standing on the windswept, super isolated shores of Easter Island. You're staring up at those giant, haunting stone statues, the moai, with their backs to the sea.
Oh, you're incredible.
They really are. And there's this incredibly romantic, almost haunting mystery to civilizational collapse. You look at these monumental ruins and you can't help but wonder, like, what happened to the people who moved these stones?
Right. Where did everyone go?
Yeah. And more importantly, you have to ask yourself, if tourists someday, maybe thousands of years from now, are going to stare mystified at the rusting hulks of our modern skyscrapers.
In like New York or Tokyo.
Exactly. Wondering how such a mighty, technologically advanced society could have just, vanished.
It really is, it's the ultimate human mystery. We're drawn to these ruins because they basically act as mirrors.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, they force us to confront our own mortality, right? Not just as individuals with a finite lifespan, but as an entire civilization. I mean, when you look at the sheer scale of the effort, the immense wealth, the engineering genius, the complex social coordination required to build those Easter Island statues or those Maya pyramids, it screams of absolute power.
Right, it's a massive flex.
It is. Yet the builders are just gone. The jungle took it all back. It completely shatters that comfortable illusion we all walk around with.
The idea that human progress is just this permanent, unbroken upward line.
Exactly.
Which is exactly why we're going exploring today. We're tackling the fundamental question of why societies fail or succeed. And to do this, we have a massive, fascinating, and honestly, highly contested stack of sources to guide us on this deep dive.
Highly contested is putting it mildly.
Oh, absolutely. So we're looking closely at the famous framework laid out by Jared Diamond in his seminal work on how societies choose to fail or succeed. But, and this is key, we are absolutely not taking his word as gospel here.
No, we definitely are not.
Right. We are actively cross-referencing his environmental theories with a blistering academic critique by Julian Morris.
It's just quite the read.
Oh, it really is. It pulls together arguments from multiple historians, biologists, and economists who look at the exact same history and see something entirely different. We also have a comprehensive study guide analyzing the core themes of these debates. And finally, just to completely shatter the paradigm, we're looking at a radical alternative theory by the anthropologist Joseph Tainter.
And, the stakes on this specific stack of material couldn't be higher. We are going to examine the prevailing narrative of our current era, this whole idea of ecocide.
Right, ecocide.
Yeah, it's the concept that societies essentially commit ecological suicide by blindly consuming their resources. We're going to deconstruct that theory, examine the hidden economic, structural, and political forces that might actually be the things driving civilizations off a cliff.
And figure out what this means for you, the listener, and the highly complex world you are living in right now.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the ancient ruins and the dusty bones, I have to ask you about the baseline assumption here. Are we, as modern people sitting in our climate-controlled rooms, fundamentally the same as those ancient Maya or Easter Islanders?
That is the big question, isn't it?
Right. I mean, are we wired to make the exact same mistakes? Or does our modern technology, our globalized trade networks, and our scientific understanding completely change the rules of the game?
So that tension right there is the beating heart of all the material we're analyzing. The ecocide narrative makes a very specific claim. It says humans are inherently prone to overexploiting their environments.
Like it's just baked into our DNA.
Yeah, exactly. And it argues that it doesn't matter if they're wielding stone axes to cut down palm trees or, driving industrial logging machinery through the Amazon. The psychological mechanism, that short-term thinking, is exactly the same. Only the scale of the destruction has changed.
But the critics push back on that, right?
Oh, forcefully. The critics and the economists in our sources assert that modern institutions, specifically things like enforceable property rights, global price signals, and technological innovation, fundamentally alter how we interact with physical limits.
They change the math.
Exactly. They argue we are not trapped in this deterministic cycle of ruin just because we consume resources.
So to really get a grip on who collapsed and why, we first need to establish what we're even talking about. We need a working theory of how a societal collapse is defined and measured.
Right, because we throw that word around a lot.
We really do. And Diamond starts his argument not in some steamy jungle, but in a place very familiar to us, the American West. He gives us this fascinating tale of two farms. First, we have Hull's farm in the Bitterroot Valley of modern-day Montana.
Okay, yeah.
It's prospering. It's a massive dairy operation run by a family, 5 siblings and their spouses. They have a state-of-the-art, high-tech barn with robotic milkers and computerized feed monitors.
Sounds pretty advanced.
Very. They are constantly expanding their acreage, and they are the undisputed economic leaders of their local community.
Then, to set up the historical parallel, Diamond places Gardar Farm right next to it in our minds.
Oh, okay, take us there.
So this was the manor farm of the Norse bishop in southwestern Greenland, established over 1,000 years ago during the Viking expansion.
Wow, 1,000 years ago.
Yeah. And when you dive into the historical and archaeological records, the similarities between Gardar and Halls are actually stunning. Both were the absolute largest, most advanced, most prosperous agricultural centers in their respective districts.
That's a crazy parallel.
Both were owned by deeply religious people, and both were centered around magnificent cutting-edge barns designed for sheltering and milking cows. I mean, stone structures at Gardar that absolutely dwarfed anything else built in Greenland at the time.
And you can't ignore the environments either. Both occupy these incredibly gorgeous, sweeping natural settings. You have the snow-capped mountains of the Bitterroot Valley for Hulls and the deep, dramatic fjords for Gardar.
Absolutely stunning places.
Right. But, crucially, beneath that beauty, both farms are situated in agriculturally marginal districts at very high northern latitudes.
Yes, and agriculturally marginal is the pivotal concept here. Because of those high latitudes, both Halls and Gardar face incredibly short, volatile summer growing seasons.
Which is tough for farming.
Extremely tough. If you're running a dairy farm, you have a very tight, unforgiving window to produce enough pasture grass and harvest enough hay to keep your massive, hungry cows alive through a long, dark winter.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
It is. This suboptimal climate makes them highly susceptible to even minor climate shifts. Like, a light spring frost or a summer drought can be absolutely devastating. Furthermore, both are geographically isolated.
Meaning they're far from the big cities.
Exactly. They are far from major population centers, meaning the transportation costs to get their goods to a wider market put them at a severe competitive disadvantage. Their local economies are heavily hostage to natural and geographic forces far beyond their control.
Yet the outcome couldn't be more utterly different. Hull's farm is thriving today, a beacon of modern agriculture. Gardar farm, though, was abandoned over 500 years ago. Every single inhabitant of Norse Greenland either starved to death in the cold, died in conflict, or packed up and left.
It's a stark contrast.
It really is. The massive stone walls of the Gardar barn are still sitting there, sinking into the permafrost, but the people are totally gone. So before we figure out why Gardar failed and Hulls hasn't, how do our sources precisely define the word collapse? Because like you said, we throw that word around a lot in the media today for like every minor economic dip.
Right, and they are very careful to distinguish it from just a normal recession or a regime change. The sources define a collapse as a drastic, measurable decrease in human population size, coupled with a severe loss of political, economic, or social complexity.
Okay, so it has to be big.
Big, and occurring over a considerable geographic area for an extended period of time. So, a new king taking over is not a collapse.
Right.
A temporary famine is not a collapse. The complete structural breakdown of how a society organizes itself, feeds itself, and protects itself, that is a collapse.
Got it. So to diagnose why this massive structural breakdown happens, Diamond offers a 5-point framework. He argues it's rarely just one cinematic asteroid strike. It's usually a cocktail of failures.
A very messy cocktail.
Exactly. Point 1 is inadvertent environmental damage. This isn't just about pollution, it's about the inherent fragility of an environment versus its resilience. For example, if you cut down a forest in a heavy rainfall zone, does the soil immediately wash away, or do the trees grow back quickly?
Right, the natural buffer.
Yeah. Point 2 is climate change. And here, he specifically means natural historical shifts in temperature or rainfall-like changes in solar radiation or ocean currents, entirely separate from anything humans are doing.
Which is an important distinction for the historical examples.
For sure. Point 3 brings in the human element, hostile neighbors. Sometimes a society weakens itself through environmental mismanagement, and an enemy simply swoops in to finish the job. taking advantage of the sudden vulnerability.
Which is fascinating because it means a historical record that just looks like a standard military conquest might actually be masking a slow, multi-generational ecological failure.
Right, the invasion is just the final symptom of the disease.
Exactly. Then point four is the converse of that, the loss of friendly trade partners. If your society depends on a neighboring empire for essential goods, say specialized tools or even just cultural cohesion and religious authority, and they collapse for their own reasons, they can easily drag you down with them.
Your supply chains just vanish overnight.
Yep. And finally, point five is the wild card, the society's response to its problems. This encompasses their cultural values, their deeply held religious beliefs, their political systems, and their economic institutions. How do they react when the crisis actually hits?
Let's try to visualize this because it's a lot of moving parts. I think of this framework like a society being dealt a hand of cards in a high-stakes poker game.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so the first 4 points are the cards you randomly draw. Point 1 is your geographic starting hand. Are you playing with a fragile island or a massive resource-rich continent? Point 2 is the shifting climate. The dealer suddenly changing the game from poker to blackjack mid-hand.
Right, suddenly it's a new game.
Exactly. Point 3 is the other players at the table trying to bluff or steal your chips. Point 4 is your partner suddenly going bankrupt and unable to back your bets. You really can't control those external variables.
But point five.
But point 5 is how you actually play the hand. It's your strategy, your institutions, your ability to adapt. So the environment is basically handing the society a hand of cards. You can't control if you draw a drought or a frozen winter,
Yeah.
but your institutions dictate how you play it. You can still bluff your way out, or you can stubbornly mismanage a winning hand and just fold.
That's a much sharper way to look at it than assuming geography just completely dictates destiny. The environment and external factors set the absolute parameters of risk, but the society's institutions, their economic incentives, and their leadership choices ultimately dictate survival or failure.
It makes a lot of sense.
It's an incredibly compelling, multifaceted diagnostic tool. However, as we dive deeper into our sources, we see that the actual application of this tool to historical events is where the academic bloodletting really begins.
Which brings us perfectly to the first major controversy of this deep dive. Let's look at Diamond's absolute purest example of ecological suicide, Easter Island. We all know the story, or at least the documentary version of it that we've been fed for decades.
The famous ecocide narrative.
Right.
Diamond presents Easter Island as a society so utterly obsessed with status and competitive monument building carving and moving those massive multi-ton stone moai that they knowingly, recklessly cut down every last tree on their tiny, isolated island.
Just chop them all down.
Yeah, they supposedly needed the massive palm trunks to use as rollers and levers to transport the stones from the volcanic quarries all the way to the coastline.
And the domino effect from that single, terrible cultural choice is described as apocalyptic. I mean, Diamond argues that cutting down the trees caused a catastrophic, cascading disaster. Think about it. No massive trees meant they could no longer build their traditional seagoing canoes.
Right, which they needed.
Exactly.
Right.
No canoes meant they could no longer hunt deep-sea porpoises, which was a massively crucial protein source in their diet. Furthermore, total deforestation exposed the land to the wind and rain, leading to massive soil erosion, which destroyed their terrestrial crop yields.
It's a grim picture.
So grim. What followed, according to this narrative, was mass starvation, a brutal apocalyptic civil war, the violent overthrow of the religious elite, and eventually a descent into pure cannibalism. By the time the first European ships arrived, they supposedly found a ruined, decimated society, huddled in the ashes of their own hubris.
It is a terrifying morality tale. But here's where we must introduce the fierce, meticulously documented pushback from our academic sources.
Yes, let's get into the critics.
When you look at the work of researchers like Benny Peiser and the detailed findings of the 1934 Franco-Belgian expedition, they honestly see that this entire ecocide narrative is largely based on fallacious mythologies, a misunderstanding of indigenous agriculture, and highly selective historical data.
Here's where it gets really interesting because the counter-evidence they present completely flips the script. I mean, it turns the whole narrative upside down. What did these critics actually find when they looked at the original European logs?
Well, when you read the actual historical accounts from the very first European arrivals, like the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, they emphatically did not find a starving, cannibalistic population huddled in a barren wasteland.
They didn't.
Not at all. They found a society that was still eating a highly nutritious, abundant diet. The Easter Islanders had developed brilliant adaptive agricultural techniques like lithic mulch.
Lithic mulch, what is that?
It's basically using volcanic rocks to protect the soil from the wind and help it retain moisture. They were intensively farming sweet potatoes, yams, and sugarcane in these rock gardens. And despite lacking deep-sea canoes, they were still catching abundant fresh fish closer to shore.
So they were doing fine.
Yeah, Roggeveen estimated the population was quite robust, perhaps around 3,000 to 4,000 people, which is entirely sustainable for an island of that size. This was certainly not a society in terminal cannibalistic decline.
Okay, wait. If they had plenty of food and they were successfully adapting their agriculture to a treeless environment using these rocks, what actually caused the massive population collapse that we absolutely know happened later on? Because by the late 19th century, there were barely over 100 native people left on the island.
The real culprit, according to the historical records highlighted by the critics, wasn't an obsession with trees. It was direct, brutal European contact. Yeah. During the 1860s, Easter Island was subjected to horrific, organized raids by Peruvian slave traders. Ships would arrive, and armed men systematically slaughtered or captured a massive portion of the able-bodied male population, hauling them off to work in the guano mines of South America.
That is horrifying.
It's awful. Furthermore, the few who were eventually repatriated brought back decimating diseases like smallpox and syphilis, releasing them into an isolated indigenous population that possessed zero natural immunity.
That completely changes the context of the Romans. But what about the statues themselves? I mean, the prevailing story is that you find half-carved statues abandoned in the quarry because the society suddenly ran out of wood to move them, realizing their mistake too late.
The alternative explanation provided by the Franco-Belgian expedition is much more direct and honestly chilling. As the anthropologist Alfred Matreau pointed out, the monumental sculpture didn't cease because of a sudden lack of timber.
Then why did it stop?
The carving stopped abruptly because the sculptors, the master artisans who held the specialized knowledge of how to carve and move those stones, were literally killed or carried off in chains during the slave raids. The society didn't commit suicide by cutting down a tree. It was systematically murdered by an invading force.
I have to say, looking at the divergence between these two historical interpretations makes me incredibly frustrated.
Yeah.
It makes me want to push back hard against this whole ecocide cottage industry.
It's a very different story.
It is. Are we, as modern industrialized people, so wrapped up in our own legitimate anxieties about global deforestation and climate change that we are projecting our sins onto ancient indigenous peoples?
Right.
Because honestly, it feels like a grotesque form of historical victim blaming.
It really does.
We're standing over their ruins saying, look at these foolish natives who blindly destroyed their own fragile environment and starved themselves to death, when the actual historical record strongly suggests they were invaded, enslaved, and wiped out by diseases brought by outsiders.
It's a highly uncomfortable realization, and it raises a critical point about confirmation bias in academia, which Julian Morris explicitly critiques in our sources.
Right, because you find what you're looking for.
Exactly. If a researcher approaches history with a pre-existing thesis, say, they are actively looking for historical examples of environmental self-destruction to serve as a warning for modern society, they might subconsciously or even consciously selectively highlight data that fits that neat narrative.
Ignoring everything else.
Right. They might focus intensely on the pollen records showing deforestation, while conveniently downplaying or totally omitting the devastating impact of the 19th century slave raids. It cautions us to be incredibly rigorous and skeptical when someone uses the past as a neat, tidy morality play to teach lessons about the present.
That is a crucial warning. If Easter Island's tale of self-destruction has these massive, glaring historical holes in it, we absolutely have to look at the second major pillar of the collapse theory, the Vikings in Greenland.
Back to the frozen north.
Yes, this brings us right back to Gardar Farm and the dairy cows in the snow. If Easter Island wasn't an ecocide, did sheer cultural stubbornness kill the Norse?
So, Diamond's thesis regarding the Greenland Norse is presented as the ultimate tragic tale of maladaptation. He argues that the Norse arrived in Greenland during a period of relatively mild climate known as the medieval warm period.
So it was actually pretty nice when they got there.
Exactly. They brought their European culture with them, and they tried to perfectly recreate a European dairy farming society in a highly fragile subarctic environment. For a few centuries at work, they built their churches, they milked their cows, they traded walrus ivory back to Europe.
Everything was humming along.
But then the climate shifted dramatically. The Little Ice Age hit. Sea ice began to block the fjords, isolating them from trade, and the growing seasons became too short to harvest enough hay for the livestock.
And according to Diamond's narrative, this is where point 5 of his framework, the society's response, dooms them.
Right, the crucial point 5.
Instead of looking at the neighboring Inuit people, the Thule culture, who are actively moving into the area and were perfectly adapted to the cold-hunting whales using harpoons, living in snow houses, the Norse supposedly refused to learn a single thing from them.
That's the claim.
They stubbornly clung to their European identity. They clung to their prestigious cows even as they starved. And most famously, Diamond claims they had some sort of bizarre cultural taboo where they absolutely refused to eat fish. So because they couldn't adapt their culture to the changing climate, they literally starved to death surrounded by an ocean full of food.
It paints a vivid picture of rigid, inflexible elites choosing death over adaptation. But once again, our critical sources bring in highly sophisticated archaeological counter-evidence, specifically the groundbreaking bone isotope analysis conducted by Danish researcher Jet Arneborg.
Okay, hold on. If you're listening to this and wondering how we could possibly know what a Viking ate for dinner 500 years ago with any level of certainty, it all comes down to bone isotopes.
It's so cool.
It is fascinating. Basically, your bones are a chemical diary of your life. The specific ratios of carbon-13 and nitrogen-15 isotopes in your diet become permanently incorporated into your bone collagen as you grow.
You are what you eat, literally.
Literally. Terrestrial food, like cows and sheep, leaves a distinctly different isotopic signature than marine food, like fish and seals. By measuring these ratios in excavated Norse skeletons, scientists don't have to guess. They can mathematically determine exactly what percentage of a specific Viking's diet came from the land versus the sea.
Exactly. The chemistry doesn't lie. And what Arneborg's isotope data reveals completely demolishes the stubborn refusal to adapt narrative.
What did they find?
The data shows that the Norse did adapt, and they adapted dramatically to the cooling climate. In the early days of the settlement, when it was warmer, their diet was indeed mostly terrestrial, very similar to their cousins back in Norway: beef, mutton, dairy.
Making sense.
But towards the end of their occupation, as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip and the pastures failed, the isotopes show that up to 80% of their diet shifted to marine sources.
80%.
Yeah, they were eating massive amounts of seal. They were heavily, actively exploiting the resources of the sea to survive.
But wait, how does Diamond justify his claim then? Because he specifically points out in his work that there is a total lack of fish bones in the Norse garbage middens, their ancient trash piles. He uses the absence of fish bones as definitive proof of their stubborn cultural taboo against eating seafood. How do the critics explain the missing fish bones if the isotopes say they were eating from the sea?
The critics point to a very basic, practical reality of archaeology and farm life that Diamond seems to overlook. Fish bones are incredibly fragile and porous. They decay rapidly in acidic soil compared to dense cow or seal bones.
Well, that makes sense.
And furthermore, whatever didn't immediately decay was highly likely to be eaten by the animals living on the farm. Hungry dogs and pigs absolutely love fish scraps. In fact, when researchers ran the same isotope analysis on the skeletons of the Norse farm dogs, it showed that the dogs had an even more marine-based diet than their human masters.
Wow, so the dogs were eating the evidence.
They were clearly eating the marine scraps. The fundamental error here is assuming that the absence of evidence in a 1,000-year-old garbage pile is evidence of absence in their actual diet.
Think about it this way. Imagine future archaeologists digging up our municipal garbage dumps 1,000 years from now. All of our organic matter, the fresh vegetables, the fruits, the healthy grains, the meat bones, will have completely composted and vanished into the dirt.
Yep, gone.
All that will survive in the archaeological record are the non-biodegradable plastic wrappers from junk food and highly processed snacks. Those future archaeologists might look at that specific layer of trash and conclude, wow, this 21st century society strictly refused to eat anything grown in the ground. They only consume synthetic substances wrapped in bright plastic.
Right, it's a total misreading of the surviving evidence.
But here is the real kicker, the thing that bothers me most about the Norse story. If the isotope data definitively proves the Norse did adapt, if they shifted their entire economy to an 80% marine diet and hunted seals, why did they still collapse and die out?
Good question.
Does this prove that sometimes, no matter how brilliantly a society responds and changes its culture, The shifting climate simply overpowers them.
I see where you're going, but it's not quite that simple. The Norse adapted their diet, but they didn't adapt their entire social structure.
What do you mean?
Well, they were still trying to maintain an incredibly top-heavy, complex European societal model. They were still maintaining massive stone churches, supporting a wealthy bishop who required imported wine investments, and trying to pay taxes in walrus ivory to a king thousands of miles away in Norway.
Oh, wow. So they kept the expensive habits.
Yeah, they adapted enough to eat seals, but they didn't adapt enough to become fully mobile, decentralized hunters like the Inuit. They tried to keep the rigid structure of Gardar Farm alive in an environment that could no longer support that level of overhead. So, yes, the climate threshold dropped, but their failure to structurally downsize is what ultimately made that climate shift fatal.
That is a crucial distinction. We've looked at the ancient world, from the Pacific to the Arctic, and we've seen how murky and debated the root causes of collapse can be. But our sources emphatically do not stop with history.
No, they bring it right up to the present.
Right. We must bring this framework out of antiquity and apply it to the modern world, because Diamond argues that these exact same mechanisms of collapse are happening right now, right under our noses. And to prove it, he points to two incredibly different places: First World Montana and Third World Rwanda.
Let's start with Montana, because the paradox of Montana is absolutely central to understanding modern environmental tensions. It is a place of breathtaking, rugged natural beauty, highly prized by both its long-term residents and a massive influx of tourists.
It's gorgeous.
It is. Yet beneath the postcard exterior, it faces severe economic struggles. We have this dynamic where wealthy out-of-stater CEOs, tech billionaires, people like Charles Schwab are coming in and buying up massive tracts of land to build 10,000 square foot mega estates for a few weeks of summer recreation.
Right, the Jackson Hole effect, basically.
Exactly. Meanwhile, many of the locals are completely priced out of the housing market and are forced to work 3 different service jobs: waitressing, running ski lifts, landscaping for the mega estates, just to stay above the poverty line.
Our outline specifically points to the story of Stan Falkow to illustrate this tension. He was this highly stressed, incredibly successful microbiologist working in a high-pressure lab out in California. And he found his only peace by escaping to the Bitterroot Valley in Montana to go fly fishing.
It's that classic escape to nature.
For him, and for so many others, Montana represents this pristine, untouched refuge from modern complexity. But overlaying this romanticized view of nature is a massive, looming environmental threat. Diamond points heavily to the toxic legacy of resource extraction in the state.
Yeah, the mining history.
He talks extensively about places like the Anaconda copper mine in Butte, the famous Berkeley pit, which generated unimaginable wealth for a few copper barons, but left behind a staggering pit of highly acidic, toxic water. Diamond uses this to claim there are some 20,000 abandoned mines scattered across Montana, silently leaking heavy metals and acid into the groundwater, poisoning the state forever.
It's a terrifying statistic. But our critical source, Kendra Okonski, who has deep professional and personal experience working with environmental policy in Montana, points out severe, fundamental, factual discrepancies in Diamond's narrative.
What kind of discrepancies?
Well, when you actually dig into the data, while Diamond claims there are 20,000 toxic abandoned mines threatening the state, Okonski notes that, depending on the state or federal agency you ask, the total number of abandoned mine sites is somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000.
Still a lot, but way less than 20,000.
Right. But more importantly, the vast majority of those are just empty holes in the ground. Only about 300 pose any environmental concern whatsoever, and only about 80 present a serious, actionable threat to water quality.
I mean, 20,000 versus 80 is not a rounding error. That is a massive, narrative-altering difference in scale.
Exactly. But Okonski's critique goes much deeper than just correcting the math. She argues that Diamond completely ignores the historical, legal, and institutional context of why those mines were abandoned in the first place.
Which is pretty important.
You simply cannot understand resource management or mismanagement in the American West without understanding the specific evolution of property rights and mineral laws, like the General Mining Act of 1872.
What did that act do?
That law explicitly encouraged citizens to explore for minerals on public land, and if they found them, to extract them, often with very little liability for the cleanup afterward, because the government actively wanted to incentivize rapid Western expansion.
Ah, so it was a policy choice.
Yes, by omitting how government rules and legal structures specifically incentivized and shaped that land use, Diamond reduces a highly complex economic and legal history to a simplistic, cartoonish morality tale of greedy businesses mindlessly destroying nature.
It feels incredibly reductive. And
Yeah.
speaking of reductive narratives, let's pivot to how the sources handle the 1994 tragedy in Rwanda. This is an incredibly heavy, dark topic.
It really is.
In a matter of mere months, an estimated 1 million people, primarily the Tutsi minority, but also moderate Hutus, were brutally slaughtered in genocidal violence. It shocked the world. How does Diamond possibly frame this massive political atrocity through his environmental lens of collapse?
Diamond attempts to frame the Rwandan genocide as a classic, unavoidable Malthusian trap.
Which, for those who need a quick refresher, refers to the grim math proposed by Thomas Malthus. He theorized that human populations explode geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, while agricultural food production only creeps up arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right, the curves cross.
So eventually, inevitably, the sheer number of mouths outstrips the physical limit of the food supply, leading to famine, disease, or horrific violence as people fight over a shrinking pie.
Precisely. Diamond looks at Rwanda, which is an incredibly densely populated, deeply agrarian country. He looks at data showing population doubling, while family farm plots were being subdivided among sons until they were too small to feed a family.
Okay, so the pressure was real.
Yes, and he views the resulting ethnic violence primarily as a spark, a fuse, lit by the underlying explosive dynamite of severe population pressure and ecological degradation. He argues they were literally fighting to the death for a few extra feet of farmland.
But the critics, specifically pulling from the meticulous work of Peter Uven, a professor of international humanitarian studies who specializes in Rwanda, fiercely and fundamentally rebut this environmental determinism. What does Uven say was the actual mechanism driving the slaughter?
Uven argues that reducing the genocide to inevitable ecological math entirely misses the true, sinister political and institutional drivers.
It wasn't just math.
No, the tragedy was absolutely not an inevitable consequence of having too many people. It was meticulously planned, organized, and orchestrated by a top-down, authoritarian state facing a political crisis.
The government did it.
Yes, the Habyarimana regime and the ruling MRND party actively instigated racism, imported massive amounts of machetes, utilized state-run radio to broadcast hate propaganda, and organized local militias to carry out the killings to maintain their grip on power.
Okay, but what about the land pressure Diamond mentions? Weren't the farmers genuinely starving and desperate because their inheritance plots were physically too small to survive on? That part is objectively true, isn't it?
They were absolutely struggling, but Uven points out the crucial mechanism of why they were trapped on those tiny farms. The Rwandan government exerted severe draconian economic controls over its citizens. They heavily restricted the private sector.
So they couldn't just leave.
Exactly. If you were a young farmer on a plot too small to feed your family, you couldn't just sell your land and move to the capital, Kigali, to get a factory job or start a business. The government maintained strict land tenure laws that required state approval for transfers, and they tightly controlled labor mobility through a system of identity cards and residency permits.
Wow, they were locked in.
The failure was not ecological. The land could have supported them if they had a dynamic economy. The failure was entirely the result of a corrupt development model based on exclusion, rigid state control, and authoritarianism that physically trapped a growing population in agrarian poverty.
Okay, synthesizing these two very different modern examples, the toxic mines of Montana and the horrors of Rwanda, I really have to push back on the core premise of Diamond's book.
It's hard not to.
Reducing a highly orchestrated political genocide to overpopulation, or reducing Montana's complex, legally driven economic struggles to a simple story of toxic corporate waste, feels not just reductive, but genuinely dangerous.
I agree.
Are we ignoring the vital role of human freedom, the absolute devastation caused by corrupt authoritarian governments, and the invisible impact of terrible economic policies simply because it's intellectually easier or maybe more politically fashionable to just blame the environment?
That is the precise, pointed critique leveled by Julian Morris and the economists in our stack. And just to remind everyone listening, we aren't taking sides here. We are just presenting what the sources say.
Of course.
But these critics argue that when we elevate environmental limits to be the prime mover of history, we inadvertently absolve terrible governance, corrupt leaders, and deeply flawed institutions of their responsibility for human suffering.
Which brings us to the grand scale of this debate. Diamond doesn't just look at isolated historical case studies or specific modern countries. He scales these local issues up to encompass the entire globe.
The whole planet.
He lays out 12 modern plagues, which he views as existential environmental threats that are currently pushing our entire globalized civilization toward imminent collapse. But what's absolutely fascinating is that the free market economists look at the exact same list of 12 threats, look at the exact same data, and see a story of unprecedented human triumph.
It's a wild difference in perspective. Let's walk through the Doomsday Dozen Diamond presents, grouping them into their core themes. Briefly, they include the rampant destruction of natural habitats, particularly tropical forests, the steep decline of wild food sources, especially the collapse of oceanic fisheries, a massive accelerating loss of global biodiversity, severe topsoil erosion from industrial agriculture, the imminent depletion of fossil fuels, the exhaustion of global freshwater aquifers, the buildup of toxic synthetic chemicals in the environment and our bodies, global warming, and finally the concept of hitting the photosynthetic ceiling.
Oh, the photosynthetic ceiling.
Yes, meaning humanity is appropriating too much of the sun's total energy budget. He argues that unless we drastically voluntarily lower our impact and consumption, we face global starvation and war within decades.
Okay, I want to pause on that photosynthetic ceiling concept because it sounds terrifying. Basically, he's arguing that there is a hard mathematical limit to the amount of solar energy that plants can convert into biomass through photosynthesis, what biologists call net primary productivity. And his point is that humans, through our crops, our pastures for livestock, and our logging, are already consuming roughly half of the entire planet's biological budget, leaving almost nothing for the rest of the natural food web.
Yes, the argument is that we are hitting a hard thermodynamic wall.
Right. But as our mission states, we have to look closely at the other side of the ledger. Let's impartially lay out the optimist's rebuttal, looking at a few of these specific plagues to understand the mechanics of their counterargument. What do the free market critics say about agriculture and the soil erosion crisis? Diamond says we are literally washing our precious topsoil into the sea at 40 times the rate it naturally replaces itself.
The critics, such as the Australian biologist Jennifer Marahasi, point out that Diamond's agricultural data is largely backward-looking.
How so?
It ignores massive ongoing technological innovations in modern farming. In wealthy nations, and increasingly across the developing world, farmers are rapidly adopting no-till farming. Historically, farmers deeply plowed the earth to kill weeds, which broke up the soil structure and allowed the wind and rain to erode it.
All right, the classic tractor plowing.
But today, by using modern, targeted herbicides to control weeds, they can leave the soil structure and the previous crop's root system entirely intact. Combined with precision application of synthetic fertilizers, this method is actually reversing erosion in many areas. It is building topsoil and radically increasing crop yields per acre.
Which crucially takes pressure off wild lands because we need less land to grow more food.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the water crisis? Diamond says aquifers are running dry, and we are fundamentally running out of fresh drinking water globally.
The economists counter that the issue is almost never a sheer global scarcity of water molecules. The crisis is almost entirely one of infrastructure, pricing, and local governance.
So it's a management problem.
Yes, wealthy industrialized nations recycle and manage water highly efficiently, and when needed, they utilize desalination technologies. When people in developing nations lack clean drinking water, it is rarely because there is no water to be found.
Why is it then?
It's usually because corrupt or incompetent local governments have failed to build the necessary treatment plants and piping networks, or because water is heavily subsidized by the state, meaning there is no price signal to incentivize conservation or repair leaky pipes.
Now, the toxic chemical debate is where things get incredibly heated and politically charged. Diamond warns of a silent spring scenario. Endocrine disruptors and synthetic toxins, lowering human sperm counts, causing massive spikes in cancer, and poisoning the environment.
And here, we must strictly report the scientific debate as presented in our sources without taking sides. Toxicologists like Stephen Safe argue that the fear often outpaces the reality. They point out that environmental concentrations of many persistent legacy compounds like PCBs or DDT have actually been decreasing rapidly for decades in the developed world.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Other researchers point out a fascinating evolutionary fact. Humans consume thousands of natural chemical pesticides every single day that plants naturally produce to defend themselves.
Wait, naturally produced pesticide?
Yeah. And many of these natural compounds test positive as carcinogens in high doses, yet our bodies process them just fine.
So the dose makes the poison, essentially.
Precisely. Furthermore, they argue you have to look at the massive trade-offs. The use of these synthetic chemicals, pesticides, and modern fertilizers has resulted in incredibly cheap, abundant food, which has massively improved global nutrition and immunity.
Right. People aren't starving as much.
Additionally, one of the greatest leaps in human health occurred when people in the developing world stopped burning wood and dung fires inside their homes for heat and cooking.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, replacing those heavily polluting organic fires with modern centralized fossil fuels or electricity drastically reduced indoor air pollution, which was a major silent killer. The net result of these chemical and industrial innovations, they argue, is a massive, undeniable increase in global human lifespans, not a toxic apocalypse.
I think the best way to understand this massive philosophical divide between the two camps is with an analogy.
Let's hear it.
It's like two groups of highly intelligent people are standing around looking at a running car engine. Diamond and the environmentalists look at it and see a mechanical system that is inevitably, mathematically burning through a finite tank of fuel, generating toxic exhaust, and they know for a fact it's eventually going to sputter and die.
Okay, I see that.
But the economists look at that exact same engine, burning the exact same fuel, but they see a machine that is constantly being redesigned on the fly by its passengers. Just as the gas gauge hits empty, the passengers invent a way for it to run on electricity or hydrogen or some entirely new fuel source we haven't even conceived of yet. Which brings us to the core economic concept that underpins their optimism.
Huh.
What is the ultimate resource?
The concept of the ultimate resource. Championed by economists like Julian Simon, it posits a radical idea. The most important, valuable resource on planet Earth is not oil or fresh water or arable land. It is the human mind.
The human mind.
Yes. It is human ingenuity operating within a free market. The mechanism works like this. As a physical resource becomes scarce, say, whale oil in the 19th century, its price naturally goes up.
Basic supply and demand.
Right. This price signal creates a massive financial incentive for human minds to invent alternatives, increase the efficiency of use, or discover completely new sources. Therefore, a growing human population isn't a burden of more hungry mouths to feed. It's an incredible asset of more brains actively working to solve our problems.
Okay, I see where you're going with the car engine analogy and the economist's faith in human ingenuity, but I have to push back on it because it feels almost dangerously optimistic.
It is very optimistic.
The economists assume we will always invent the new fuel just in time. But what if the engine blows a gasket or seizes up before the new fuel is invented? What if the ecosystem collapses before the technological fix scales up? That seems to be the massive gap in their logic.
That is the exact vulnerability in the economic model. It relies on a continuous, unbroken chain of just-in-time technological miracles. If you look at the macro trends over the last century, the economists are right. Despite explosive population growth, global life expectancy has skyrocketed, extreme poverty has plummeted, and per capita food production has increased.
So history is on their side so far.
The data heavily favors the human ingenuity model so far, but relying purely on miracles carries an immense systemic risk. And that risk, the danger of the system itself becoming too heavy to innovate, leads us perfectly to our final, most paradigm-shifting source.
Exactly. If Diamond's theory of simple ecological suicide has massive historical holes in it, and the economist's human ingenuity theory feels a little too recklessly reliant on future miracles, is there a third way? Is there a different, deeper structural explanation for why great, powerful empires suddenly crumble into dust?
Enter Joseph Tainter.
Yes. This is where we look at Tainter's seminal work, The Collapse of Complex Societies. It fundamentally alters the entire conversation.
It really does.
He completely rejects both the idea that societies collapse simply because they run out of a physical resource like wood, and he rejects the idea that elites are just too stupid, rigid, or mismanaged to solve their environmental problems.
So if it's not trees and it's not bad kings, what is his fundamental premise? How does he explain the ruins?
Well, Cantor argues that human societies are basically giant, collective, problem-solving algorithms.
Okay, I'm tracking.
When a society faces a problem, say, a military threat from a neighboring tribe, or a sudden need to increase food production due to population growth, or a desire for internal political stability, they solve that problem by adding complexity to their structure.
When you say adding complexity, what does that actually look like on the ground?
It means adding layers. It means creating new bureaucracies. It means establishing professional standing armies instead of relying on local militias. It means building massive interregional infrastructure networks like roads and aqueducts.
Specialization, basically.
Exactly. It means increasing specialized roles. People stop farming and become full-time scribes, or tax collectors, or priests. In the beginning, this strategy works brilliantly. Adding a specialized, centralized irrigation department dramatically increases crop yields across the valley. Adding a professional, well-equipped standing army secures the borders and brings in massive wealth through plunder.
But there is always a but in history.
Always. But Tainter introduces a crucial, inescapable economic concept: the law of declining marginal returns.
Oh, okay.
Initially, a small investment in complexity yields a massive societal benefit. But as a society grows more and more complex, the curve flattens out. Each additional layer of bureaucracy, each new military garrison, each new administrative patch costs more and more energy and resources to maintain, but yields a smaller and smaller relative benefit to the society.
Let's ground this abstract theory by using the ultimate historical example, the Roman Empire. How does Tainter map this curve of complexity onto the fall of Rome?
Rome is the perfect, terrifying illustration of this mechanism. In its early days, Rome aggressively expanded specifically to extract resources and wealth from conquered territories.
Right, standard empire building.
This massive expansion required a highly organized military. To pay that professional military, they needed standardized taxes. To collect taxes efficiently across a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, they needed a vast, complex administration.
So layers on layers.
For a few centuries, this was incredibly profitable. The loot and slaves pouring in from the conquest of Gaul or the East vastly exceeded the overhead cost of maintaining the army.
But eventually they ran out of easy, wealthy places to conquer. They hit the geographic limits of their technology. They hit the cold, dark borders of the Atlantic Ocean, the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert, and the deep, impoverished Germanic forests. The expansion halted.
Precisely. The incoming loot stopped, but the massive, crushing overhead costs remained. In fact, they grew. They had to maintain the vast army just to hold the borders, they had to maintain the endless stone walls, and they had to support a bloated imperial bureaucracy operating out of multiple capitals.
They couldn't afford themselves anymore.
Right. The Roman society hit a point of negative marginal returns. The sheer cost of maintaining the complexity was actively draining the empire dry. To survive and pay the army, emperors like Diocletian resorted to desperate economic measures. They systematically debased the silver currency, causing rampant hyperinflation.
Just printing money, essentially.
Yes. And to try and control the inflation, they issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, which just created massive black markets and shortages. They taxed the peasant farmers so brutally that farmers literally abandoned their ancestral lands because they couldn't pay.
Which means less food being grown.
Right. And in response to that, the state made professions hereditary. If your father was a soldier, a baker, or a tenant farmer, you had to be one too, essentially laying the legal groundwork for medieval serfdom and completely locking up social mobility.
And this leads to Tainter's absolute mind-bending, counterintuitive conclusion. He argues that by the end of the Western Empire, the average citizens of Rome were so utterly crushed by the weight of their own incredibly complex extractive government that they actually preferred to be conquered by the incoming Germanic barbarians.
It sounds crazy, but it makes sense.
The Visigoths and the Vandals demanded fewer taxes and less bureaucracy than the Roman tax collectors.
That is the absolute crux of Tainter's theory. Collapse, in his view, isn't necessarily a sudden, dramatic Hollywood tragedy of fire, ruin, and despair. Sometimes it is a highly rational economic choice by the population.
It's a downsizing.
It is a necessary, albeit painful, downsizing. When the overhead cost of maintaining the imperial structure becomes significantly more expensive and burdensome than the benefits that empire actually provides to its citizens, collapsing into smaller, simpler, more localized, more efficient units is the only way for the actual population to survive.
Okay, but there is a catch here. Tainter says this rational downsizing, this collapse into simpler units, only happens under a very specific geopolitical condition, right? He calls it a power vacuum.
Yes, he uses the term peer polity competition. If the late Roman Empire had been sitting right next door to another highly complex, technologically equal empire, say a fully unified Persian Empire right on their border, the very moment Rome tried to downsize or weaken its military complexity, the Persians would have simply marched in, conquered them, and absorbed their territory and
So
resources.
you can't downsize if someone stronger is watching.
Exactly. Collapse into simpler, peaceful, local units can only happen if there is a power vacuum, meaning there are no peer neighbors strong enough to immediately take advantage of your structural weakness.
I think every single person listening to this can relate to Tainter's theory in their modern lives, even if they don't care about Rome.
Oh, for sure.
Think about a massive monolithic corporate monopoly, or think about a sprawling piece of legacy computer software that has been constantly updated and patched for 20 years. Eventually, you have so many layers of middle management requiring meetings about meetings, or so many thousands of lines of code trying to patch bugs in previous patches, that the whole system just completely freezes.
Every new minor initiative takes 5 years and $1 billion.
Right. The only actual fix isn't to write yet another patch or hire another consultant. It's a hard reboot. You have to scrap the entire bloated code base and start over with something simpler. It makes me ask a very uncomfortable question. Is our modern, highly regulated, massively bureaucratic global society approaching the point of negative returns on our own complexity?
The question that keeps sociologists up at night. If you look at the exponentially rising administrative costs of modern healthcare systems, where doctors spend more time doing compliance paperwork than seeing patients,
Oh, that's a great example.
or the administrative bloat in higher education, or the staggering multi-decade price tags and endless environmental review timelines required just to build basic infrastructure, like a subway line or a bridge in the developed world today. Tainter's theory provides a very chilling, highly structural lens through which to view our current trajectory. We keep adding layers to solve problems, but the layers are becoming the problem.
So synthesizing this entire massive journey we've been on,
It's been a journey.
it really has. We have traveled from the overgrown, humid ruins of the ancient Maya to the high-tech, robotic dairy farms of modern Montana. We've looked deeply at Diamond's stern warning that we are blindly, greedily destroying our physical environmental foundation.
We've examined the free market economist's counterargument that human innovation, strong property rights, and free institutions are the ultimate resource that will continually allow us to invent our way out of scarcity.
And finally, we explored Tainter's structural warning that our own incredible complexity, the very tool we use to solve all our problems, might eventually mathematically crush us under its own bureaucratic weight.
And tying all of these disparate theories together is the modern reality of globalization. It acts as a massive double-edged sword in the collapse debate.
How so?
Well, Diamond looks at globalization and warns that it means there are no isolated islands left. If one crucial part of the global system fails, the contagion spreads instantly, and we all collapse together.
A domino effect.
But the economists, however, look at that same interconnectedness and argue the exact opposite. They argue globalization creates massive, robust resilience and redundancy. If a wheat crop fails due to drought in one hemisphere, we don't starve. We simply use price signals and shipping networks to trade our way out of the local failure by importing from the other hemisphere.
They argue this immense interconnectivity might be our greatest defense against the kind of isolated local vulnerabilities that ultimately doomed the Norse in Greenland or the Easter Islanders.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to take away from all these sources. We started this deep dive staring at the jungle ruins of the Maya and the stone faces of Easter Island, wondering with a bit of dread if a sudden dramatic apocalypse is coming for our own cities.
A natural fear.
But what if we stop looking at the concept of collapse as a dramatic Hollywood movie with meteors, zombies, and instant fiery chaos? What if the next collapse is just a quiet, gradual, entirely rational decision by millions of people to simply stop participating in an overly complex, overly expensive system?
Like a quiet quitting of civilization.
Exactly. What if people, feeling the crush of negative marginal returns, choose the lying flat movement? What if they choose to unplug, to downscale their economic ambitions, to move out of the expensive megacities and focus entirely on the local, because maintaining the global structure is just too exhausting and unrewarding? Could the collapse of our incredibly complex society actually be something we actively, peacefully choose, not out of despair, but for our own profound relief? It's definitely something to mull over the next time you are stuck in traffic, looking up at the sprawling, complicated skyline of your city.